Welcome to your Daily 5 for Thursday, August 21st, 2025. You may have read, or more likely had seen some reaction to, comments from a former executive this particular article says PlayStation US, but it also says that this individual was head of their global worldwide studios when they left Sony. So I don't know what the official title is, but a higher up in Sony up until 2019, an individual named Sean Layden was doing a feature, interview, whatever, with gamesindustry.biz, which I'll admit is not a site I go to very often, meaning at all. And of course, as you would expect, one of the topics that came up was the price of video games. And you may not be all that shocked that Layden felt that game prices were too cheap. In fact, game prices should probably go up with every console generation. Not something that's a new opinion from higher ups in companies that tend to like to make money. But there was one quote that caught my eye in here. The quote is, quote, "The cost of construction is just way too high. If you're going to spend over $200 million to build a game, your margins are super tight unless you can expect to sell 25 million units. Unless you're Rockstar, you should not expect to sell 25 million units." End quote. Now, in a vacuum, I don't have any issue with that statement. That's basic business. You make something for a certain amount of money, you have to have a return, otherwise you go out of business. So it seems reasonable when you read that by itself. Nothing really crazy about it. But you have to think about this from all sides. And it's funny that this individual brings up Rockstar, because Rockstar is one of the companies that often gets cited by many people who are correctly saying that video games are simply costing too much money. And so even though you could justify price raises because of the amount of investment, what is harder to justify is what that investment is actually providing to the player. Now, that's a subjective thing, but let's take something specific. You may remember when Red Dead Redemption came out, one of the features of the game was that the testicles of your horse would accurately respond to the temperature of the area that you were in. And this was something that somebody was paid, I'm sure, a good amount of money to code and make sure worked properly in a shipped game. How many people of however many units and people that were invested in that game do you think really cared about that detail? And for the ones who were, is that really something that should be a company's priority? So when you hear about things like that, you start to think, well, wait a minute. Okay, yes, it's a lot of money, but why are you spending that money? What is that actually delivering? What objective quality of video game immersion does that provide? And the other side of it is, because again, it is subjective to some degree. Okay, fine. Games are expensive. You invest a lot of money. What happens when the game doesn't work? What recourse does the consumer have? I'll tell you, not very much, because refund policies are fairly strict. I think Steam's is 2 hours, which isn't unreasonable. I think that's probably the most generous one around that I can think of, outside of buying it off like Amazon and just doing a return of an open game, but even that has its limit. But Sony is notoriously very strict, speaking of PlayStation. In fact, the Cyberpunk 2077 delisting and refunds were remarkable because they so rarely happen from Sony. So when almost every game has a day one patch, when there are games that are updated weeks, months, sometimes years later in ways that wipe out a player's progress, this has happened more than a couple of times. What, you can't go back a year later, or even a couple weeks later, and say, hey, you know what? You just erased 30 hours of my life that I spent on this game. I want my money back. They're not going to refund that. So what good is that investment if there is no guarantee on the other side for the consumer? That's what I mean about this quote in itself is not one many people could argue with. It's basic math, really, and how the mechanics of business. But when you look at the totality of how the transactions often occur between the publisher or the game owner and the person buying it, it is certainly not a one-to-one even balance. You can't just get an easy refund if a game doesn't actually work. And so again, what does all this investment mean if there is no guarantee on the other side to the player that a game is going to function? And without that, this quote means nothing. It's just a quote by somebody who represented a company wanting to make money. So, like I said, reading it makes sense, but thinking about it in context, a completely worthless statement. So, hey, read it for yourself and you tell me what you think. Later.